Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take complex source material, sometimes dense, often contradictory, and we try to pull out the core knowledge, key insights, and bring them straight to you.
And today, we're tackling something pretty significant. It's, a major controversy surrounding one of the world's best-known public broadcasters, the BBC.
Right. And the sources we've looked at, they don't just talk about criticism. They paint a picture of an institution under intense pressure, almost like an empire under...
They really do. The language is quite striking. One source describes the BBC as being besieged by many different forces.
Besieged. And there's this sense of real panic, isn't there, among what the sources call the metropolitan liberal elite class?
Total panic is the phrase used. They apparently see the BBC as their most important capital city. Losing it feels existential.
A capital city, that really frames it, doesn't it? It's not just a media outlet. It's seen as this huge center of, ideological power, cultural influence.
And to really hammer home how serious this perceived threat is, the sources use this really vivid historical metaphor. They compare the situation to the fall of Nineveh.
Nineveh. Okay, so for anyone needing a quick history refresh, that was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, right? Powerful, sometimes seen as, pretty ruthless.
Exactly. So if the BBC is the modern Assyrian Empire in this analogy,
then who are the Medes and Persians storming the gates?
Well, the source identifies this coalition. It's a mix of forces. You've got the populist right, maybe the Farage types, elements of the populist left, maybe thinking Corbynites, and then other powerful interests, perhaps internationalists.
Little disparate groups.
Very disparate. But the idea is they've all recognized that this Assyrian Empire, the BBC, might have, stretched itself too thin, become vulnerable.
And they sense an opportunity.
That's the argument, that they can exploit this moment of weakness, even if they couldn't beat the institution at its strongest.
Which suggests this is way more than just another media argument. It sounds like, according to these sources, an existential challenge to how the BBC currently operates.
Absolutely. So our mission today really is to unpack these core claims. We're looking at leaked internal documents, public statements.
All alleging that the BBC isn't just an impartial broadcaster.
No, the claim is it's acting more like an ideological instrument of propaganda. They even use the term media halo.
A media halo, what does that imply?
That it uses its reputation for trust, its global reach, to propagandize the masses, basically, to shape the narrative along specific ideological lines.
Right. So the central conflict here is that the BBC's whole brand, its global reputation, built on impartiality for decades,
is being directly contradicted by these allegations of deliberate misinformation. Not just mistakes, but deliberate acts.
And these allegations are serious enough to trush resignations at the very top and, crucially, major legal threat.
Precisely. Yeah. We're going to start with this specific incident that seems to have kicked this current crisis into high gear, this alleged bold-faced lie about Donald Trump in January 6th.
Okay.
And then we'll dive into the broader systemic claims of bias laid out in this whistleblower memo that got leaked.
And just a quick note on perspective before we dive in. The sources we're drawing from today are, it's fair to say, extremely critical of the BBC.
Very critical. They argue that the problems aren't just isolated errors, which, let's be honest, happen everywhere.
Sure.
They see them as features, symptoms of a deep, underlying ideological commitment, what they label globalist liberalism.
Okay, so that's the framework. Let's get into the specifics then. Section 1, the incident that seemingly lit the fuse, right? The spark. The sources point to one particular event as the big lie, the one the BBC couldn't just apologize away. It involves the flagship documentary program, Panorama.
Yes, and the Panorama brand is key here. It's supposed to be the gold standard of BBC investigation. Rigorous, impartial truth-seeking. That's the...
So when an allegation of deliberate fabrication comes from Panorama, it hits harder.
Much harder. The reputational damage is magnified massively. And this specific allegation concerns a clip about Donald Trump's speech on January 6th.
Okay, and the core of the allegation is about editing.
Exactly. The claim is that Panorama created a false impression that Trump was directly inciting an immediate violent attack on the Capitol.
Ow. By cutting and pasting different parts of...
Precisely. They took two separate phrases from different points in the speech and joined them together, making it sound like one continuous instruction.
What was the edited quote they broadcast?
The quote aired was, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol cut, and I'll be there with you, and we fight like hell."
Right. I remember the controversy around that. What do the sources say was left out? What's the crucial omission?
The sources argue that the full context included lines that framed the walk down very different. Specifically, they point to lines like, "We're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women."
So suggesting support for the political process happening inside the building rather than an attack on the building.
That's the argument. By cutting that context, the sources claim the BBC fundamentally altered the meaning. It shifted from, political encouragement to what sounded like a direct call for the violence that followed.
And the sources stress this wasn't just a slip-up, right? Not just clumsy edit.
No. They emphasized it required conscious effort. You had to edit the video to make the visual cut seamless, and you had to edit the audio to make the two separate sound bites flow together naturally.
So deliberate.
Deliberate action, designed specifically to mislead viewers about Trump's intent, framing him as directly responsible for ordering the storming of the Capitol building itself, not just the rally nearby.
And the later whistleblower memo, it backed this up.
It did. The memo reportedly called it maliciously splicing together two parts of the speech and said it completely changed the substantive content. For an organization supposedly built on truth, that's about as serious a charge as you can get.
So the fallout. This specific edit didn't just cause outrage, it had real consequence, partly because of who the subject was.
Yes, absolutely. It directly led to this internal memo by Michael Prescott being leaked.
Yeah.
But arguably, more importantly, it prompted a direct legal threat from Donald Trump himself.
And that's where the real institutional panic sets in, according to the system.
Yes. They described Trump as, well, famously litigious, someone who actively dislikes the media, sees them as dishonest.
And he wasn't just threatening a small claims.
No. The figure being thrown around is $1 billion.
Yeah.
$1 billion lawsuit potentially filed in a Florida court.
Okay, $1 billion is obviously a huge number for any news outlet. But why is it uniquely terrifying, almost existential for the BBC?
It comes down to how the BBC is funded. It's a public service broadcast. Around 65%, maybe more, of its money comes from the license.
Right, and we should clarify for listeners outside the UK, the license fee isn't like a net subscription.
Not at all. It's a legally mandated annual payment. Basically, if you watch live TV on any channel or use the BBC's online iPlayer service, you have to pay it. It's effectively a tax.
So if the BBC loses $1 billion lawsuit in the US,
that money ultimately has to come from the public purse. Either services get cut drastically, or they'd have to try and raise the license, which is already deeply unpopular.
So this specific lie, or alleged lie, became incredibly dangerous because the subject, Trump, had the means and the motive to hit back hard financially.
Exactly. Unlike maybe other subjects of critical reporting who might complain but can't really afford to sue on that scale, this was different. This was a credible, massive financial threat.
Which explains the swift reaction from the top.
It does. The BBC did issue an apology, carefully worded, of course, calling it an error of judgment, not a lie.
And then the resignations.
Yes. The Director General, Tim Davie, and the CEO of News, Deborah Turnett, both stepped down. Officially, it was over a series of mistakes.
But the sources are clear.
The sources insist that while other issues might have been bubbling, the real catalyst, the thing driving the panic and these high-level departures, was the Trump incident and that looming billion-dollar threat in a U.S. court.
Okay, so if the Trump panorama incident was the immediate trigger, the detailed memo from the internal whistleblower, Michael Prescott, is presented as the evidence suggesting this wasn't just a one-off.
Exactly. This memo argues that the panorama issue is actually symptomatic of a much deeper systemic problem within the BBC's culture and practice.
And Prescott himself, he had credibility within the industry, right? He wasn't just some random disgruntled employee.
No, he was the political editor for the Sunday Times for about a decade. So he understands the ins and outs of political journalism. He claimed he wrote the memo out of despair. Despair at management's failure to address what he saw as serious ongoing issues.
He also tried to frame himself as nonpartisan, didn't he? Saying he didn't have strong views on U.S. politics or the Middle East.
He did claim that, yeah. Though the sources we looked at are pretty skeptical about that claim, given how focused and, frankly, partisan the memo seems in its criticism. But the core issue isn't really his personal politics. It's the accuracy of his observations about...
Right. So leaping into the first major allegation, bias in U.S. elections. What did Prescott claim?
He alleged the BBC consistently ignored its own editorial guides, specifically the rules that say you shouldn't give excessive weight to single, potentially unreliable.
And he had a specific example.
Yes, he pointed to the BBC giving, in his words, undue weight and excessive coverage to one particular rogue Iowa poll. This poll came out just before the election and suggested Kamala Harris was on track for a surprise.
And the argument is this wasn't just reporting data, it was narrative.
That's the claim, that the BBC chose to amplify this outlier poll because it fed a preferred narrative of a potential Harris victory, even though their own rules should have cautioned against it.
And this focus on potentially skewed data was part of a broader pattern, according...
Yes, Prescott argued it reflected a wider issue prioritization bias. He claimed the BBC focused disproportionately on campaign themes, heavily pushed by the Harris campaign, things like abortion, women's rights, climate change.
At the expense of other issues.
At the expense, he argued, of issues that were actually significant drivers for many U.S. voters: the economy, jobs, and particularly immigration. The idea is the coverage choices reflected the preoccupations of a liberal newsroom, not necessarily the electorate's priorities.
And this extended to the actual language used in reporting.
Apparently so. The memo criticized a tendency to adopt the framing and terminology favored by one side. For example, using terms like reproductive rights as neutral description, rather than attributing it as a campaign term.
So the sources basically say the staff were just reflecting their own bubble, mostly liberal, urban, educated.
And they simply believed in the causes they were reporting on, which made truly objective coverage, almost impossible in practice.
And the most serious part of this U.S. election, the fact-checking allegation.
Right. Prescott alleged there's a clear imbalance. He claimed the BBC applied much less scrutiny, less rigorous fact-checking to questionable statements made by Harris compared to the intense, almost forensic fact-checking applied to everything Trump said.
Suggesting the BBC was acting more like a campaign booster than a neutral referee.
That's the implication, yes. Acting as an activist rather than an arbiter.
And this perceived mindset, this bias, wasn't just limited to U.S. politics. The memo argues it seeped into domestic UK coverage, too, particularly around race and diversity.
Yes, this is where the memo gets really controversial. Prescott made allegations of racial biases in favor of minority, going so far as to suggest the institution was effectively, and this is the source's interpretation of the memo's claim, incredibly anti-white, or acting against the interests of the native people of their own country. Very strongly.
Okay, that's highly charged. We need specific examples here to understand what Prescott was claiming led to that. What did the memo cite?
One example given was called the insurance swindle that never was. It related to BBC reporting that suggested minority groups were facing systematic racial bias and being overcharged or defrauded by insurance companies.
And Prescott's claim was that this narrative was false or exaggerated.
The claim in the source material, analyzing the memo, is that the BBC pushed this narrative hard, but when the actual data was fully examined, the evidence for a widespread, racially motivated swindle just wasn't there, or was vastly overstated. Yet the initial narrative, driven by a desire to find systemic racism, was never properly corrected.
Okay, what was the other main example? The insecure jobs.
This involved reporting on statistics that seemed to show a huge rise in insecure or precarious employment, particularly affecting minority workers since around 2011.
And again, the allegation is manipulation or biased frame.
The sources analyzing Prescott argue the BBC presented these stats with an inherent racial bias. They allegedly failed to give enough weight to other potential factors, things like age demographics within different groups, shifts in specific industries, regional economic changes that could also explain the rise in insecure work for those groups.
So, by focusing almost exclusively on race as the cause,
Prescott alleges the BBC was pushing a specific activist interpretation of structural inequality rather than presenting a more complex, nuanced picture. The overall effect, the sources argue, was to promote a narrative pitting minority groups against the supposedly privileged native majority, hence the anti-native accusation.
But perhaps the most sort of insidious allegation in the memo relates not just to framing, but to actively controlling the flow of information using technology. The BBC's push notification.
Yes, this is a powerful claim. It's about censorship through omission, using the BBC's massive digital reach. The source, based on the memo, alleges the BBC deliberately used its push alerts, which go instantly to millions of phones, as an outlier in ignoring immigration issues.
Deliberately ignoring immigration. Why?
The allegation is the BBC was consciously crafting what people know about along liberal woke lines on purpose, essentially deciding which topics were suitable for urgent public attention and which weren't, based on a political agenda.
That is a huge accusation. What specific immigration stories did the memo claim were suppressed or downplayed via these notifications?
Several politically sensitive examples were cited. First, news about the government allocating new resources to tackle the huge backlog in asylum claims, apparently not deemed worthy of a push alert to millions.
Okay.
Second, the rejection of certain international asylum agreements like one with Albania, again, allegedly ignored by the alert system.
And the third one, probably the most explosive.
The daily cost of housing asylum seekers in hotels. The sources point out this runs into billions. They estimate around £4 billion a year, a huge sum of public money.
And the claim is the BBC deliberately chose not to push that information out wide.
That's the allegation. That the BBC decided millions of license fee payers didn't need an urgent notification about this massive ongoing cost, suggesting, the sources argue, a political motive to dampen public concern about immigration levels and cost.
Wow. If you control the alerts, you control the perception of urgency. That's subtle but incredibly powerful.
It's a form of agenda setting. You don't even have to actively misreport a story. You just decide it's not important enough for immediate widespread attention. And if you do that consistently with topics that challenge a liberal worldview, like the scale and cost of immigration.
Yeah, you effectively shape the entire public conversation without telling a single explicit lie.
Precisely. It's managing reality by managing attention.
Okay, moving on. The Prescott memo also touched on other areas of alleged ideological bias, didn't it? Highly sensitive cultural issues like gender identity.
Yes, it did. The memo reportedly stated the BBC was fully on the really radical claims of transgender act. It suggested a deep, pervasive bias in how the corporation covered issues of biological sex versus gender identity.
This ties into the controversies around things like the Tavistock Clinic in the UK, doesn't it?
Absolutely. For listeners who aren't familiar, the Tavistock Clinic housed the UK's main gender identity service for young. It's since been ordered to close and undergo a major overhaul following a critical review, the CAS review, which raised serious concerns about clinical practices and safeguarding.
And the memo alleged the BBC's coverage during the lead-up to this was biased.
That's the claim, that the BBC was pushing extreme versions of identity politics, consistently siding with activist claims over, say, biological facts, established medical concerns, or even the worries of parents and some clinicians.
And this wasn't just external reporting bias, it affected staff internally.
Apparently so. The sources mention former BBC journalists like Emily Maitlis talking about the internal atmosphere. She described a fear of saying the wrong thing, of tripping an ideological tripwire.
A fear of colleagues and management not just getting the facts wrong.
Exactly. She spoke about being nervous covering sensitive stories like Tavistock, fearing for her job if she didn't adhere to the perceived pro-transgender internal consensus. The sources use this to argue the BBC wasn't just biased outwards, it was enforcing an internal ideological line, stifling proper journalistic questioning.
And the memo suggested this pattern of bias wasn't new. It pointed to historical examples, too.
Yes, it referenced previous analyses of BBC coverage, particularly around Brexit. These studies, cited in the sources discussing the memo, apparently showed a consistent pro-EU bias, roughly 2-to-1 in terms of airtime or favorable framing during that whole long debate.
Which fits the broader narrative the sources are pushing.
Perfectly. The argument is the BBC workforce is predominantly London-based, university-educated, largely reflecting that metropolitan liberal elite who mostly favored Remain. So the Brexit coverage bias wasn't an accident. It was a natural reflection of the institution's own internal leaning.
And finally, Prescott apparently contrasted how the BBC covered different kinds of public protests.
Yes, this is another example used to highlight alleged double standard. The source compares the coverage of Black Lives Matter, BLM, protests during the COVID lockdown with the coverage of, say, counter-protests by groups sometimes labeled Native British.
What was the alleged difference in coverage?
During the strict lockdowns, many BLM protests clearly breached the rules on mass gathering. The source claims the BBC tended to make excuses for this, downplaying the health risk or any associated disorder or violence.
Compared to how counter-protest covered.
Compared to, for instance, rallies about protecting historical statues or other counter-protests. In those cases, the source alleges the BBC was much quicker to highlight any violence, frame the participants negatively, or emphasize breaches of lockdown rules.
So another example, according to the sources, of a consistent pattern.
Yes, pro-minority, pro-globalist causes treated sympathetically. Issues concerning the native population or challenging the liberal consensus framed negatively. It all feeds into this picture of an institution with a clear, baked-in ideological hierarchy that dictates its news judgment.
Okay, so you have the specific Trump panorama incident blowing up, and then this incredibly detailed Prescott memo leaking, alleging systemic bias across. How did the BBC leadership react publicly? The sources seem to suggest it wasn't exactly with humility.
No, the descriptions are quite the opposite. Defensive, self-congratulatory even, and according to the sources, showing very little genuine contrition or acknowledgement of the scale of the problem laid out in the memo.
Let's look at the former Director General, Tim Davis, his reaction after resigning.
His departure speech was highlighted by the sources as, well, quite defiant. They specifically note he was apparently seen smirking when mentioning the billion-dollar Trump lawsuit threat.
Smirking? That suggests a certain lack of concern, doesn't it?
Or perhaps misplaced confidence. But the sources interpret it as showing a lack of seriousness or shame about the crisis engulfing the institution he led.
And he defended the journalists.
Fiercely. He said he was very proud of our journalists, claimed the BBC was doing wonderful work, even as this internal memo detailing widespread alleged deceit was circulating.
But it was the specific language he used to rally the troops that the sources really hung in on, wasn't it?
Yes. This is crucial to their argument. Davey reportedly used what the sources call the language of war, not the language of impartial journalists. He told staff, "We've got to fight for our journalism."
Okay, fight for our journalism. That could just mean defending stands.
But then he explicitly talked about our narrative and critically about having enemies.
Our narrative and enemies. Let's unpack why the sources see that as so damning.
Their argument is simple. A truly neutral, objective public broadcast funded by everyone through that mandatory license fee shouldn't have a narrative it needs to fight. Its narrative should just be the fact, the truth, presented impartially.
And it shouldn't have enemies either, presumably, unless maybe openly hostile states.
Exactly. If you're neutral, you report on different viewpoints. You don't define sections of your own society or political figures who disagree with you as enemies. The sources argue that Davey, by using this language, accidentally demolished the whole fiction of BBC neutrality.
It revealed an underlying deep intentionality, a sense that the BBC sees itself as a player in an ideological battle.
That's precisely the interpretation, that the resignation speech was an unwitting confession that the institution is partisan, that it does have a side, a narrative it's fighting to impose.
Yet, at the same time, the official line remained one of denial.
Yes, Deborah Turnus, the outgoing CEO of News, formally stated the BBC is not institutionally biased. She tried to frame the whole thing as just a series of unfortunate, unconnected mistakes or management blips,
which the sources flatly reject.
Completely. They argue it's just not credible that the specific deliberate manipulation alleged in the Trump case just coincidentally aligns perfectly with all the other patterns of alleged left-wing liberal lies detailed across U.S. politics, race, gender, immigration in the Prescott memo. They see a coherent agenda, not coincidence.
And this institutional defensiveness, it sometimes comes across as quite dismissive of the public that funds.
The sources certainly argue that. They point to comments made by Lord Patton, a former chair. He was apparently asked about the fact that the BBC staff is overwhelmingly drawn from a specific demographic, urban graduate liberal, and doesn't really reflect the diversity of the UK population.
And his response was dismissive.
The sources describe it as a curule response. Essentially, Patton seemed to imply that the background or worldview of the staff didn't matter, that their elite perspective was inherently objective, or
which the sources read as
utter contempt for the license. The attitude being, we know best, you just pay up and accept the narrative we provide, whether it reflects your reality.
And crucially, this perception of bias isn't just confined to these critical source disgruntled whistle. The public perception data backs it up.
It really does. The data shows a significant and growing trust deficit. The sources cite polling from 2023 showing only 19% of people in the UK thought the BBC was generally neutral.
Only 19%. Wow. Was that a decline?
Yes, down from 22% just a few years before. And perhaps more starkly, about half, 50% of people surveyed actively believe the BBC is political.
So a majority see bias. How does that bias break down in perception, left or right?
The figures showed 31% believe the bias leans left, while 19% believe it leans right. So a clear plurality sees a left-wing bias. The key point the sources stress is that when only 1 in 5 people agree with your core mission statement of neutrality, that mission is basically failing in the public's eyes. Trust has been declining for a long time.
So the sources conclude that the real unacknowledged bias, the one the elite doesn't even see as bias because it's just their default worldview, is this leaning towards
globalism, liberalism, and what they term extreme versions of identity politics.
And this worldview isn't neutral in its effects.
No, the sources argue it actively creates an animus, a hostility towards the traditional, the local, the familiar, the parochial. It fosters a bias against, in their words, the native peoples of each country.
Which, in their view, explains why the institution might feel justified in manipulating information to protect this preferred world order from threats.
That's the underlying argument, that the perceived righteousness of their globalist liberal cause makes bending or breaking the rules of impartiality seem acceptable, even necessary, when facing opposition they deem illegitimate or dangerous.
Okay, so to really drive home the idea that this isn't just a blip, the sources argue you need to look at this history. They suggest this problem of misinformation or bias is almost congenital, baked in.
Yes, the argument is that the issues raised by Prescott aren't new. They're part of a long-standing pattern. And again, Panorama, the flagship investigative show, comes up repeatedly as a case study for these historical failings.
Beyond the recent Trump incident, what other Panorama examples cite to suggest a history of, well, alleged dishonesty?
One case mentioned is the Ben Westerman incident. Panorama investigated alleged anti-Semitism, and Westerman was interviewed as part of a disciplinary process. The broadcast apparently portrayed him as anti-Semitic.
But he disputed that.
He claimed he had his own recording of the full interview, which contradicted the way the BBC edited and presented it. He argued they essentially fabricated the anti-Semitism claim to fit their narrative.
Okay, and another perhaps more politically charged example involving Panorama.
The incident often referred to as panodrama, which happened about 6 years prior. It involved the reporter John Sweeney and the controversial activist Tommy Robinson.
Right. What was the allegation?
The source claims the BBC essentially collaborated with a partisan campaigning group, Hope Not Hate, with the explicit aim of producing a documentary to stitch up Robinson, basically, to destroy his reputation through selective editing and framing rather than objective reporting.
So working with activists against a perceived enemy.
That's the allegation. That Sweeney was even caught on undercover footage admitting the goal was hostile, not journalistic. It feeds that narrative of the BBC defining enemies and then abandoning impartiality to attack them.
And the source we're drawing on makes this personal, too, citing an alleged fabrication about the cell.
Yes, there's a specific incident mentioned where the BBC allegedly ran a story claiming that the host, after losing an election, went back to the town of Totnes and somehow radicalized the entire town towards right-wing views.
Radicalized the whole town. Was there any proof offered? Footage? Witnesses?
According to the source, absolutely none. No evidence was ever presented that this return trip even happened, let alone that it caused mass radicalization. Yet, when a formal complaint was made,
the BBC defended the story.
Aggressively defended it. And this brings us to the role of the regulator, Ofcom.
Right. Ofcom is supposed to be the independent watchdog ensuring broadcasters stick to the rules, including impartiality. What happened when this complaint went to Ofcom?
The source claims Ofcom sided entirely with the BBC, despite the complete lack of evidence for the original story.
So the argument is Ofcom isn't truly independent.
The source argues Ofcom effectively acts as an enabler, regulating the BBC in line with what the BBC already believed. It provides a sort of institutional cover, making genuine external accountability very difficult to achieve.
Now, beyond political bias, the sources also raise another deeply uncomfortable act of the BBC's history, what they call its horrific.
Yes, this refers to the scandals involving systemic child sexual abuse, primarily the cases of Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris, but suggesting there were likely others. The sheer number of pedophiles that the BBC has harbored over decades.
Why bring this up in the context of political bias? What's the connection the source is making?
It's a stark point about institutional priorities and, frankly, hypocrisy. The source argues that the political and media elite, the establishment, were horrified by Savile, yes, but they didn't fundamentally panic about the institution itself in the same way they're panicking now.
Why not? Surely harboring abusers is a massive institutional failure.
It is, morally. But the source argues the elite doesn't truly care about those moral failings because, while horrific, they didn't threaten the underlying ideological power structure. Tolerating abuse didn't undermine the BBC's role as a shaper of political narratives.
But allegations of systemic political bias do threaten.
Exactly. That's what causes the total panic. Because if the public stops believing the BBC is neutral, if the media halo slips, then its power to propagandize the masses, as the source puts it, is fundamentally broken. The political utility is lost, moral failure is survivable, loss of perceived neutrality is potentially fatal to its ideological function.
And this perceived lack of accountability, this alleged bias, leads directly to a democratic representation argument, doesn't it?
It does. The source makes a simple point. The BBC is funded by a compulsory tax, the license fee. About 65% of its funding comes this way. Therefore, they argue, the public paying that fee, all sections of it are entitled to have their views and concerns reflected.
Especially if roughly half the country holds views perceived as right-leaning or populist.
Precise. Yet, figures who represent those views, people like Farage or Tommy Robinson, even when they demonstrably mobilize huge numbers of people,
they're almost never given a platform, not for a proper discussion of the issues driving their support.
Rarely, if ever, in a way that allows them to articulate their case fully. The source sees this as deliberate gatekeep. The BBC, acting as the national broadcaster, actively filters out perspectives that challenge the dominant liberal consensus.
So the charge is that the institution, funded by everyone, effectively locks out half the population from having their voice heard or their issues fairly represented within it.
That's the core of the democratic deficit argument being made against the BBC.
Okay, so we've got the external pressures, Trump, the populists, declining public trust. We've got the internal evidence via the Prescott memo. The final piece of this puzzle, according to the sources, involves the immediate power dynamics inside. There's a theory that the resignations weren't just about the Trump lie itself.
Right. This is the internal coup theory. Quite intricate. The sources suggest that the Panorama Trump scandal, while real and damaging, was also conveniently seized upon as a pretext.
A pretext for what?
For a kind of internal push, orchestrated, the source alleges, by pro-Israel forces within or close to the BBC's governance structure.
Pro-Israel forces, why would they want the leadership out?
The allegation is they were unhappy with the BBC's editorial line on the Middle East conflict. They felt the coverage was becoming too sympathetic to Gaza, or perhaps not pushing the Israel line hard enough.
So they used the Trump incident as leverage to oust the leadership overseeing that coverage.
That's the theory presented. It suggests a factional battle playing out behind this.
And the sources name a key figure allegedly involved in this, Robbie Gibb.
Yes, Robbie Gibb is singled out, He's a current BBC board member known to have strong ties to the Conservative Party, and he was also involved previously in the acquisition of the Jewish Chronicle newspaper.
So someone with considerable political clout and connections in relevant media circles.
Exactly. The source positions him as a central figure in this alleged push against the existing management, who were perceived by this faction as being too aligned with the internationalist liberal view on the Middle.
Which sets up this internal clash, this factional dilemma.
It does. The fight, as framed by the sources, is between these internationalist liberals, seen as insufficiently pro-Israel or too sympathetic to Palestinians, and a more staunchly Zionist or pro-Israel faction.
And the sources' position on this internal fight?
It's nuanced. They state clearly they don't ideologically support the pro-Israel faction's aim. However, they do support the action of destabilizing the current leadership.
Why? Because it weakens the overall metropolitan liberal elite.
Precisely. They see it as an opportunistic strike that damages the credibility and stability of the dominant liberal faction running the BBC. The enemy of my enemy, perhaps. The goal isn't necessarily to install a new bias, but to expose and shatter the old one's claim to neutrality.
This internal turmoil, coupled with the external pressure, must be creating headaches for mainstream politics too, especially Labor leader Keir Starmer.
Oh, huge. The sources describe Starmer as being in a real pickle.
Why him?
Well, Starmer has spent years carefully moving Labor away from the Corbyn era, trying to occupy the center ground, appear pragmatic. Crucially, he also made very public efforts to build bridges with Donald Trump, reportedly even flattering him about British traditions and downplaying past criticism.
So now, with Trump accusing the BBC of lying, and the BBC being a bastion of the liberal establishment Starmer needs, he's caught in the middle.
Completely trapped.
Yeah.
If he defends the BBC, says it's impartial, he looks out of touch with the significant chunk of the UK public who think it's biased. Plus, he potentially alienates Trump, a possible future U.S. president he tried hard to court.
And if he sides with Trump against the BBC,
then he risks enraging his own party's core liberal base, many of whom still see the BBC as a vital, almost sacred institution. There's no easy win for him here.
We saw other Labour figures trying to navigate. Lisa Nandy MP defended the B Parliament.
She did, calling it a light on the hill, very much the traditional defense. But even she had to address the Robbie Gibb situation, the alleged internal maneuver.
And what was her line on Gibb? Calls were coming from other Liberals, like Ed Davey, to sack him from the board. Right?
Yes, the pressure was on. But Nandy effectively said Gibb's actions highlighting factual inaccuracies the BBC had already been forced to apologize for didn't actually meet the legal threshold for sacking him.
Which the sources interpret
as Gibb, having successfully played his hand, he used the undeniable facts of the Trump lie and the massive legal threat it carried as ammunition his internal opponents couldn't easily dismiss. He essentially outmaneuvered them using the BBC's own admitted failure.
So where does this all lead? What's the ultimate endgame the sources foresee or perhaps hope for? It seems to center on the license.
Yes, the abolition of the license fee is presented as the ultimate prize, the potentially fatal blow to the BBC in its current form. And this is where Nigel Farage comes back into the picture.
As a potential catalyst for
the sources see him, or the political movement he represents, as being in a uniquely strong position. If he gains significant power, perhaps even influences the next government heavily, he has made it very clear he views the BBC as irredeemably biased. Abolishing the compulsory fee would be a key policy.
And forcing the BBC off the public purse, what would that mean practically?
It would likely force it to become a subscription service, competing in the open market like Netflix or Sky. No more guaranteed billions from taxpayers, regardless of whether people trust or watch it.
Which would fundamentally change its nature.
Completely. It would have to actually appeal to paying customers, cater to demand. The sources argue this would effectively neuter its ability to function as this top-down propaganda arm, pushing a specific elite worldview funded by everyone else.
So the source concludes the real winning move here isn't about replacing one bias with another, not swapping liberalism for Zionism or Corbynism.
No, the strategic goal articulated is simply to force the BBC to admit its partisan, to shatter the myth of neutrality.
Because that myth is what sustains its power.
Exactly. Destroy the myth. Destroy the unique authority it holds. This combination of external populist pressure and the internal coup exploiting the Trump scandal, it's the coalition, the barbarian, finally breaching the walls of the elite's capital city. #outro.
So quite a journey we've been on. We started with that very specific, very damaging allegation, the deliberate splicing of the Trump quote, leading to that huge legal threat.
And from there, we followed the trail into the Michael Prescott memo, uncovering these really broad systemic claims of bias, covering U.S. elections, race, gender, immigration, a whole sweep of sensitive issues.
We saw the institutional response, defensive, defiant, using language like our narrative and enemies.
Which the sources argue was a crucial tell. An accidental admission almost of the underlying ideological commitment that contradicts the public mission of neutrality.
So the critical takeaway for you listening to this seems to be about this crisis of trust. The BBC's defense rests heavily on this idea, this myth maybe, of objectivity.
But with only 19% of the public actually believing it's neutral anymore, that foundation looks incredibly shaky. The sources suggest we're seeing institutions that used to occupy the center being forced by the pressures we've discussed to reveal their inherent partisan.
A development welcomed by populists on both the right, like Farage, and maybe even elements on the left.
Yes, the collapse of that perceived neutral center potentially opens up space for other viewpoints.
Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought tying back to that license threat.
If the BBC is forced off the public purse, if it has to become just another subscription service, competing for viewers.
What happens to that dominant metropolitan liberal world? Can it maintain its grip on the national narrative without that massive taxpayer-funded megaphone it's had for decades?
Or, as the sources predict, could this actually lead to a more fragmented, maybe a more genuinely pluralistic political landscape, where different viewpoints have to compete on a more level playing? That's the big question left.